two aspects in Nancy Cartwright's philosophy, empirical philosophy. So the first one I'm going to call the doctrine of no free lunch. So basically, in science, one's assumptions have to be warranted. So this is related to what Nancy was saying yesterday about baby steps. And the second aspect I want to look at, I'll call the doctrine of messiness. So suspicion about general principles. And this relates to what Nancy was saying yesterday about singular facts and the primacy of singular facts over the general. And in particular, I'm interested in the doctrine of messiness as it applies to causation, and in particular, this principle of the common cause. So what I want to do is as follows. I'll set up the doctrine of no free lunch and say why I think it's attractive. Then I'll look at the doctrine of messiness as it applies to the principle of the common cause. And then I want to argue that there is a tension between those two doctrines, a tension which comes to light when you ask, how could one reliably judge of a particular case whether or not the principle of the common cause holds for that case? And having set up that tension, I'll then sort of speculate about how one might resolve that tension. Okay, so first of all, the doctrine of no free lunch. So in order to set up this doctrine, I'll be using the concept of a rationale, and I should say a little bit about what a rationale is. So imagine there is a polling company that collects a sample of British voters, and they discover that 44% of people in their sample are going to vote Tory in the next election, and 35% are going to vote Labour. And on the basis of this evidence, they conclude that more people are going to vote Tory than Labour in the next election. But it's not just that they draw that conclusion on the basis of that evidence. They also can tell a story about why it is that that evidence is evidence for that conclusion. And that story might be the well-known standard statistical story about inference from random samples. So that's just what I mean by rationale. A rationale is any story that you can tell that makes explicit the warrant for a conclusion, that tells you why it is or how it is that the evidence you're pointing to really is evidence for that conclusion. And it'll be important for my purposes to point out that these rationales make assumptions. So in this case, the key assumption is that the sample is random or almost random. So that's rationales. And with that notion of a rationale in mind, you can introduce this notion, a rather extreme version, I would say, of empiricism. And this says, until you can provide a sufficiently explicit rationale for being confident in your conclusion, then your evidence does not warrant your being confident in that conclusion. So the idea is that if you can't make sufficiently explicit your warrant for the conclusion, then you're being irresponsible, and so you're not really warranted at all in drawing that conclusion. But I take it that this extreme empiricist thesis is pretty implausible. So for example, imagine you go shopping in Tesco every Wednesday, and over the course of the last year, you've noticed that about 60% of the time at the checkout you're served by a woman. And then the next time you go into Tesco on a Wednesday, you have more than 50% confidence that you're going to be served by a woman. Well, I take it that your degree of confidence there is perfectly warranted, even if you haven't taken a course on statistics and statistical inference. So even though you can't make explicit fully the rationale that means that these observed frequencies that you've seen, that evidence warrants your conclusion in being at least 50% confident in being served by a woman. So this, I think, is a bit too extreme. But at least I'm pretty tempted by a much more modest version of this extreme empiricism, which says that this extreme empirical thesis is true in some circumstances, at least at the level of research community. So here's a more modest version of empiricism. You might say, look, for some scientific issues, they are sufficiently intricate that until your research community has available to it an explicit rationale for being confident in your conclusion, then your evidence does not warrant confidence in that conclusion. So that's to say, look, science often is just so difficult that if you can't make explicit that rationale, if someone in your community can't, then you're irresponsible in drawing that conclusion. So that's the first aspect of what I'll call modest empiricism. And the second aspect, something you might add to this quite naturally, is that whenever one's research community knows of an explicit rationale such as that, your conclusion is warranted only insofar as the assumptions of your rationale are themselves warranted. So for example, if you imagine a really irresponsible polling company that never bothers to check whether its sample is representative or random, but in one instance, just by random luck, happens to have got a representative sample, but it doesn't know that it's got it, well, this principle here says that the conclusions that that polling company draws from that sample are unwarranted. Why? Because the assumption of random or representative sampling is unwarranted. So this is the doctrine of no free lunch. You better make sure that your assumptions in your rationales are warranted. So there's some further reasons I think that this, you might criticize that modest empirical thesis. Perhaps in Q&A we can talk about why I'm still attracted to it. But now I want to move on to the second pillar of Cartwrightian empiricism, namely the doctrine of messiness, as it applies to the principle of the common cause. So many different ways in which you can state the principle of the common cause. Here's the one that I happen to think is most defensible. If you've got a variable A and another variable B, and they're correlated with respect to a generic case, then those two variables are causally linked. So for example, if inflation and economic output are correlated with respect to the generic case modern capitalist economy, then inflation and output are causally linked for modern capitalist economies. Where causally linked might involve inflation causing output or output causing inflation, or it might involve there being a third variable, a common cause, that is a cause of both inflation and of output. Okay, so that's the principle of the common cause. And it's important to point out why the principle of the common cause is so important in medicine and in the quantitative social sciences. So here's an example of the principle at work. Imagine you are interested in whether Twitter use is a cause of political extremism. And you design an experiment where you allocate people to a treatment and control group on the basis of a toss of a coin. And the people in the treatment group, you make them go on Twitter for 3 hours, and the people in the control group, you make them do some other activity. And imagine that you observe that amongst the treatment group who had all this extra Twitter usage, the instances of some metric of political extremism are significantly higher than the control group. Well, that's then strong evidence that the coin toss, whether you're allocated to treatment or control, correlates with political extremism. But the principle of the common cause then steps in and says, well, if they correlate, they must be causally linked, the coin toss and extremism. And then you might argue as follows, look, there are only 4 ways in which those two variables could be causally linked. So way number 1, the coin toss causes Twitter use, and Twitter use causes is a cause of political extremism. Way number 2, the coin toss causes political extremism, but via some other causal route. Way 3, somehow political extremism causes the outcome of the coin toss. And option 4, there's some other variable that's both the cause of the outcome of the coin toss and of political extremism. And then you might say, look, ways 2, 3, and 4 are implausible in this instance, so we're left with option 1, and option 1 says that Twitter use is a cause of political extremism. So that's how you might use the principle of the common cause, or indeed how social scientists do use the principle of the common cause to draw causal conclusions from correlational data. But unfortunately, there are a number of putative counterexamples to the principle of the common cause. So these are instances where you've got a correlation between two variables, A and B, but intuitively, it doesn't seem like those two variables are causally linked to each other. So, classic example from Elliott Sober, take on the one hand bread prices in England, on the other hand, take the sea levels in Venice. Presumably, those two things are not causally linked to each other, but they are each increasing variables, variables which increase over time. And because both these variables increase over time, they're going to be to some degree correlated. So here we have a counterexample where two variables are correlated, but they're not causally linked. Lots of other putative counterexamples. So cases in which the generic case is insufficiently homogeneous, a so-called mixed population, appear to be counterexamples too. Cases where the variables A and B are connected because of sort of definitional or logical reasons. Well, there the variables might correlate, but the link they have isn't causal. The link they have is more logical or definitional. So the question then becomes, okay, so in light of these putative counterexamples to the principle of the common cause, what are we going to do? So one option would be to say, look, every time we find a new counterexample, we'll just add a further qualification to the principle. So you discover these time series counterexamples, and then you say, look, the principle has to have this extra qualification that it doesn't apply when the variables are time series variables. You find the next counterexample, and then you add another qualification. So the idea is you try to say the truth of the principle as a generally applicable principle by narrowing its scope. But I take it the Cartwright approach to this is very different. The Cartwright approach is to say, look, the world is a very messy place. There are very few general truths about the world. And the fact that you keep finding these counterexamples to the principle is testament to that messiness. And indeed, the fact that you keep finding these counterexamples shows you that you're probably going to continue to find counterexamples. So it's a hopeless endeavor to try and qualify the principle. No matter how far you qualify the principle is never quite going to be true. So this is a kind of Cartwrightian doctrine of messiness applied to the principle of common cause. There's no informative way of qualifying this principle to make it true for all cases. Okay. So now let me raise why I think there's a tension between these two doctrines. And this tension comes to light, I think, when you ask the question, okay, let's say the principle of common cause holds in some cases, but not others, as the doctrine of messiness says. It's sometimes true, but not always. Well, then how could inquirers reliably judge whether or not it's true in any given case? So I'm now going to go through three ways in which you might answer that question and suggest that each of those ways, each of them fails. So here's one potential answer. So let's imagine the person running the Twitter experiment. You might suggest that just before the experimenter runs the Twitter experiment, she might have some independent means of coming to know that the top cost of the coin is causally linked to political extremism. That is to say, some means other than actually running the experiment and analyzing the data from the experiment. So let's imagine for the moment that's true, that she can establish that this toss of the coin is causally linked to political extremism. Well, it follows from that that either those two variables are causally linked or they don't correlate. But another way of re-expressing that claim is just that if they correlate, then they are causally linked. But that's just to say that the principle of the common cause applies in this particular case, the case of this Twitter experiment. So if this is what I said is true, we now have a way of coming to know that the principle of the common cause is true in this particular case, the Twitter experiment. And then one might proceed, as I described previously. One might then run the experiment and discover that the toss of the coin and political extremism correlate with each other. Then applying the principle of the common cause, which we now know works in this case, you conclude that the cost of the coin is causally linked to political extremism. And then, given the arguments I ran through before, you conclude that Twitter use causes political extremism. So that, I think, is okay as a story about how one might come to discover that the principle of common cause is true in this particular case. But notice the following problem. Premise 1 is exactly the same as premise 6. And the suggestion on the table is that we somehow have this independent method, independent of the experiment, of discovering that premise 1 is true. In other words, we have a way, independent of running the experiment, of discovering that premise 6 is true. But if that's right, we can just use that method to establish premise 6 and move immediately to premise 7. We don't need to, via premise 5, actually bother running the experiment. So yes, this is a way in which one could come in a particular case to know that the principle of common cause is true for a case, but it's not one which is going to be helpful here because it's one which, if it works, makes the whole Twitter experiment entirely redundant. Okay, so that's option 1. Here's a second option. Maybe, so let's say in the Twitter case, the principle of the common cause is true, does hold for that case. Well, maybe you can just come to know that that's true via some form of direct perception. So here, I mean, I guess what I want to say is I just find this, I mean, I can't sort of begin to really understand how that might work. So, in cases of perception, there's some fact in the environment. That fact causes some symptoms of that fact. Information about those symptoms are picked up via your senses through interacting with the environment and through quite a kind of complex process of interpreting that information using lots of background knowledge, perhaps, you come to then form a judgment. But for perception to work, there needs to be this complicated causal chain from the fact in the environment you're interested in to some symptoms of that fact to your senses and then to your judgment. But in this instance, it's just a mystery to me what that causal chain could be. I mean, how is the fact that in the Twitter case, the principle of the common cause hold going to travel via causal chain to your senses? Yeah, I can't think of anything. So for me, this suggestion doesn't work. Okay, here's a third and final suggestion. Well, maybe one can know that the principle of the common cause holds in the Twitter case via sort of maybe the warrant is a priori, or maybe the way we get it is through some sort of intuition. So I think there's lots of different ways you could try and make this story work. And I think maybe the most convincing, at least in my mind, is some story involving natural selection. So you might think, look, there are certain types of case, let's call them types A, B, and C, where it's appropriate to apply the principle of the common cause. And there are other types of cases, types D, E, and F, where it's not appropriate to apply the principle of the common cause. And you might think that natural selection has operated on humans and selected for the ability, the sort of predisposition to apply the principle of common cause in situations of type A, B, and C, but not to apply it in situations of type D, E, and F. And you might think that by natural selecting acting on humans, giving us these sort of predispositions or prejudices, those predispositions or prejudices, but when to apply the principle, embody a form of knowledge. Now, everything I've said so far, I'm okay with. But notice that, back in the Pleistocene period, for example, when, natural selection was acting, heavily on humans, obviously Twitter didn't exist. So natural selection couldn't have directly encoded the belief or the predisposition to apply the principle of the common cause in the Twitter case. What must have happened is something like what I described previously. It gives you the predisposition to apply the principle of the common cause in cases of type A, B, and C, but not in cases of type D, E, and F. And then in modern world, you come to believe or come to see that the Twitter case is a case of type B, and so you then apply the principle of the common cause in that case. But notice that if that's your story, that conflicts with the Cartwrightian doctrine of messiness as applied to the principle of the common cause, because what one is now saying is that there are delineated conditions, D, E, and F, in which the principle doesn't hold, and there are conditions A, B, and C in which it almost always does hold, or in sufficiently many cases does hold. So that story is incompatible, I say, with the Cartwrightian doctrine of messiness. A second problem, it seems to me, is that, I think if you just sort of ask, everyday normal people, and also if you ask, quantitative social scientists, for example, it seems to me that they're pretty much willing to apply the principle of the cause indiscriminately. So insofar as we do have these sort of prejudices, these intuitions, these predispositions, given by natural selection, if Nancy is right, that the principle of common cause has all these, if messiness is true of it, then people's intuitions, I think, are unreliable in this case because they're not sufficiently discriminating. Okay, so those are three reasons or three stories that you might try and tell to show that people's judgments about whether the principle of the common cause holds in a particular case are reliable. And what I'm suggesting is that I don't think any of those stories work. So this leads me to the following conclusion. If the doctrine of messiness is true as applied to the principle of the common cause, then whenever Tanya, our experimenter in the Twitter case, whenever she judges that the principle of common cause applies in her case, and whenever it does in fact apply, that's not because Tanya has any reliable way of coming to know that it applies, and this fact is just a pure coincidence. So that's the conclusion I want to draw from my attempt to tell those three stories there. So now I can sort of summarize everything I've said here by the following argument, which I hope brings out why I think there's a tension between these two doctrines. So here's the argument. So the argument starts by saying, look, the no free lunch principle applies to the case of working out whether Twitter use caused political extremism. The case of whether Twitter use caused political extremism is a sufficiently intricate scientific issue that unless you have an explicit rationale for drawing that conclusion, where you know that you have kind of warranted assumptions in the rationale, unless you know that, you're not warranted in the conclusion. So that's the first step. No free lunch as applied to the Twitter case. But all the existing rationales in medicine and the quantitative social sciences for drawing conclusions like Twitter use causes extremism from correlational evidence, such as we get in that experiment, assume that the principle of common cause applies to the case in question. So, if you are taking the potential outcomes approach, for example, very common in medicine or experimental sciences, you're going to assume something like the principle of the common cause. If you instead are using structural equation models with error terms and applying, say, instrumental variables analysis to those, you're going to have to assume something like the principle of common cause holds. Or if you're doing something like causal modeling in the style of Judea Pearl, depicting causes on these Bayesian nets, these causal graphs, you're going to be applying the causal Markov principle, and that just entails the principle of the common cause. So all the existing rationales for drawing those sorts of conclusions from correlational data assume the principle of common cause applies in the case in question. So our experimenter in the Twitter case, Tanya, has warrant for her causal conclusion only if she's warranted in taking the principle of the common cause to apply to her experiment. But I think it's fair to say she's only warranted in taking that principle to apply only if it's not a pure coincidence that her judgment about whether it applies is true. But I've just argued, if the doctrine of messiness is true, then it is indeed a pure coincidence that Tanya's judgment that, here is true. So conclusion, if the doctrine of messiness is true, then Tanya does not have warrant for her causal conclusion. And this is a pretty radical form of skepticism that follows. So basically, most of the methods done by clinical medicine, the quantitative social sciences, if these two doctrines are true, the doctrine of no free lunch and the doctrine of messiness, then you get a very radical, skeptical, and I would say unpalatably skeptical conclusion. So that's basically the outline of the talk. And I now just want to sort of indulge myself slightly by speculating on how I see how one might resolve this tension here. So what I think one ought to do in light of all this is reevaluate the doctrine of messiness. So to do that, I mean, consider the claim that all democracies hold elections. So it seems to me that claim is true without exception. And the explanation for why that claim is true without exception is that there's a certain role we want our notion of democracy to play. Our notion of democracy is a normative ideal that democrats hold countries to. And it's a really important part of that ideal that countries hold elections. And that's why in defining the concept of democracy, one stipulates that it's a necessary condition of being a democracy that a country hold elections. So notice that that explanation of why all democracies hold elections is true without exception in no way presupposes that the world itself is nice, clean, neat, and regular at all. It's perfectly compatible with a huge messiness of the world. Rather, the kind of cleanness, the lack of exceptionness of that truth is explained by the sort of single-mindedness, the cleanness of the uses to which we want to put the concept of democracy. It's really important to us to make sure that countries have elections. So what I want to suggest is that the same is true of our causal concepts. So I suggest we start by asking a very Cartwrightian question: what purposes do we want our concept of causation for? And in the work I'm currently doing, in a sort of much bigger book-length project, I suggest that the answer to this question is not quite the answer that Nancy gives, namely causal decision theory. Yes, there is a very intimate connection between decision-making and policy-making and causation, but it's not quite the one that Nancy gives. And I argue that if you see the role of causation as slightly different, the result is that you can show that an unqualified version of the principle of common cause holds for all cases. And what explains why that principle is true for all cases has nothing to do with the world being neat and regular. It's to do with the single-mindedness of the goal to which we want to put our causal concept. And finally, then I think if you then go back to these putative counterexamples to the principle of the common cause, with this single-minded goal in mind, I think you can look at each of those supposed counterexamples and have a well-motivated story to tell about why you should be very happy just to bite the bullet and say that the principle of common cause applies despite our intuitions. The point of a theory of causation is not to match up with all your intuitions about causation, it's to do a very particular job. A job which, if it's going to do it, the principle of the common cause needs to be true and needs to be true for all cases. Okay, yeah, that is the talk.